60 years after HMS Hood exploded and vanished beneath the Atlantic, a small team lowered robotic cameras into the freezing darkness at 63 degrees 24.247 minutes north. They did not just find wreckage, they uncovered evidence that shattered decades of speculation about Britain's most celebrated warship. How could the pride of the Royal Navy, once hailed as unsinkable, vanish in less than 3 minutes? The answer begins where the legend was born. Construction began on September 1, 1916, at the John Brown & Company shipyard on the River Clyde. The blueprints on the slipway were redrawn after the Battle of Jutland, where British battlecruisers suffered devastating magazine explosions. Designers responded by thickening the main belt armor and revising internal subdivisions, but the need for speed and firepower still outweighed demands for all-around protection. Work pressed on through the final years of World War I. The Royal Navy sought to maintain its edge against any future threat. Dominated the shipyard's skyline. Hood's hull stretched 262 meters from bow to stern. At the time, no warship in the world matched her length or displacement. Each section of armor plate, each rivet hammered into place, reflected the lessons learned from Jutland and the urgency of a navy determined to avoid past mistakes. The hull was launched on August 22, 1918, her massive bulk sliding into the Clyde before a crowd of shipwrights and naval officials. Wartime shortages and shifting priorities delayed completion, but the work never truly stopped. Shipfitters, engineers, and gunners labored through the end of the war and into the uneasy peace that followed. By May 15, 1920, Hood was ready for commission. She displaced over 41,000 tons, carried 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, and was driven by 24 Yarrow boilers feeding 4 Parsons turbines. At full power, she could reach speeds up to 32 knots, faster than most battleships afloat. Her beam measured 31.7 meters, and her silhouette, with tall masts and raked funnels, became instantly recognizable. The ship's complement swelled to more than 1,400 men, including officers, ratings, and Marines, as she joined the fleet as flagship of the battlecruiser squadron. Hood's commissioning signaled more than just another warship entering service. She was the product of a navy still haunted by the losses at Jutland, determined to project strength and regain confidence. The shipyard's work gave way to the routines of the fleet, sea trials, gunnery drills, and preparations for a new era of global presence. The largest warship in the world was now ready to leave the Clyde and take her place at the center of British naval power. In the years that followed her commissioning, HMS Hood became more than just the largest warship afloat. She was a floating ambassador for Britain's global reach. The Empire cruise from 1923 to 1924 sent Hood and her squadron on a 40,000-mile journey to ports across the world, from the sunlit harbors of Australia and New Zealand to the bustling docks of Cape Town and Bombay. Crowds gathered wherever she appeared, drawn by the sight of her towering masts and the thunder of her saluting guns. Newspapers splashed her image across their front pages, hailing her as the mighty Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy and a symbol of stability in uncertain times. Children lined up to tour her decks, while dignitaries posed for photographs beside her officers. Postcards and souvenirs flooded the empire, each bearing the sleek outline of Hood and the promise of British strength on distant seas. In an era marked by political upheaval and economic hardship, Hood's presence offered reassurance, a tangible reminder that the Royal Navy still ruled the waves. The Admiralty cultivated this image with care. Hood's crew drilled in immaculate uniforms, her decks scrubbed to a shine before every port call. Her band played stirring marches as she steamed into foreign harbors, flags flying and signal lamps flashing. Even her routine maneuvers became public spectacle, chronicled by newsreel cameras and broadcast to millions. The myth of her invincibility took root, fed by headlines and speeches that called her unsinkable. For the men who served aboard, life on Hood meant more than duty. It meant pride. Veterans recalled the camaraderie of those long voyages, the sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Letters home described the thrill of crossing the equator, the spectacle of fleet reviews, and the awe in the eyes of those who watched Hood glide past at full speed. By the end of the Empire cruise, Hood was not just a ship, but a legend. Her name conjured images of strength and certainty, a bulwark against the storms of the age. The world believed in her, and so did Britain. The stage was set for a story that would move from triumph to tragedy. But in these years, Hood sailed on, the very image of invulnerability. Haunted. HMS Hood's designers faced a problem that haunted every line of her blueprints. After Jutland, the Admiralty demanded a ship that could outgun and outrun any rival, but also survive the kind of magazine explosions that had doomed so many battlecruisers. The answer on paper was armor, thick enough to stop the heaviest shells, but not so heavy that it would slow the ship or limit her range. Calculations stacked up in the drawing rooms at the Admiralty, each one a compromise between protection, speed, and firepower. Armor. The main belt running along Hood's sides at the waterline reached a thickness of 12 inches, 305 millimeters of Krupp cemented steel. This was intended to shrug off direct hits from enemy shells at close to medium range. Above and below, secondary belts tapered down to 7 inches and 5 inches, adding layers to the ship's defense against horizontal fire. On paper, these figures matched or exceeded the best of her era. Vulnerability. But the real vulnerability lay above. The deck armor meant to shield the ship from plunging shells and aerial bombs remained thin by any standard, averaging just over 2 inches, 51 millimeters across most of the ship. Over the magazines, the thickest point reached 3 inches, 76 millimeters. Designers knew this was a risk, but the limits of metallurgy and the need to keep weight down forced their hand. Trade-off. Every extra ton of armor pressed the hull deeper into the water, reducing the freeboard at the bow and making the ship ride lower in heavy seas. With the added weight, Hood's bow sat so low that sailors joked she was the largest submarine in the fleet. Leaks. This trade-off shaped every aspect of Hood's construction. The hull grew heavier by nearly 5,000 tons compared to the original design, deepening her draft and making her a wet ship in rough weather. Water found its way below through ventilation shafts and seams, sometimes flooding living quarters and ammunition spaces. The crew accepted this discomfort as the price of speed and strength, but the engineering reports from the time tell a different story. One of persistent leaks, rust, and the constant battle to keep the sea at bay. Limitation. The Admiralty's own immunity zone calculations meant to define the range at which Hood could expect to resist enemy shells revealed a stark limitation. Against the threat of 15-inch shells, like those later carried by Bismarck, Hood's side armor offered real protection at close range. But at longer distances, where shells descended at steep angles, the thin decks left the magazines exposed. Gambled. The designers understood the numbers, but in the aftermath of Jutland, they gambled that speed and gunnery would keep Hood out of the danger zone. Silent flaw. The result was a ship that looked invincible from the outside, but carried a silent flaw beneath her decks. The balance between armor and agility had been struck, but not resolved. In the years ahead, as naval gunnery advanced and new threats emerged, that flaw would become more than a theoretical risk. It would define Hood's fate in a way no calculation could predict. By the late 1930s, the world's navies were racing ahead, and Hood began to show her age in ways that could no longer be ignored. The original promise of 32 knots faded as her turbines wore down from decades of hard service. By 1941, Hood could barely manage 26.5 knots, still fast for a capital ship, but no longer enough to guarantee tactical freedom. Every knot lost meant less ability to dictate range, less chance to close or escape at will, and less margin for error when facing a new generation of enemies. The Admiralty had drawn up plans for a sweeping modernization. The proposal called for new engines, reinforced decks, advanced radar, and improved fire control systems. Everything needed to bring Hood in line with the battleships now coming out of German and American yards. But the outbreak of war put those ambitions on hold. Dockyards were overwhelmed, resources stretched thin, and every available hull was needed at sea. Hood's modernization was scheduled for early 1941, then postponed, then quietly abandoned. Instead, she remained in service, her machinery growing more temperamental with each passing month. Inside the engine rooms, the reality was even starker. The Yarrow boilers and Parsons turbines, once the pride of the fleet, now demanded constant attention. Engineers fought a losing battle against scale, leaks, and vibration. Reports noted falling output and rising maintenance hours. The ship's fuel consumption climbed, further limiting her operational range. In rough weather, the pounding of the hull and the low freeboard at the bow meant water sometimes found its way into compartments never designed to be wet. Hood's crew adapted, but the ship's best days were behind her. Meanwhile, naval warfare was changing at a pace few had imagined. The Germans had learned the same lessons as the British, but with the benefit of time and new technology. Bismarck, completed in 1940, carried not just thicker armor, but also a new generation of fire control computers and radar rangefinders. Her 15-inch guns, firing shells weighing 800 kilograms, could deliver plunging fire at ranges where Hood's deck armor offered little real protection. The gunnery duels of the First World War, fought at medium range, were giving way to battles decided at distances of 15,000 meters or more. British naval doctrine still valued speed and aggressive maneuver, but Hood's declining power plant reduced her options. In a fleet action, she could no longer count on outrunning a determined opponent. In a duel, she would struggle to keep the range where her side armor mattered most. The planned upgrades, thicker deck armor, new machinery, and modern electronics might have restored some of her edge. Instead, Hood went to war with the tools and tactics of a fading era. The men who served aboard felt the change, pride mixed with unease. Letters and memoirs from the period describe the sense of pride that never quite masked the growing anxiety. They drilled and trained as before, but the ship's reputation as unsinkable began to feel more like a hope than a certainty. In the wardroom and the engine spaces, officers and ratings alike knew that the next battle would test not just their courage, but the limits of a ship built for another time. As Bismarck and Prince Eugen prepared to break out into the Atlantic, Hood was once again called to the front line. She sailed with the weight of history and expectation, but also with the knowledge that the technological race had left her exposed. The sea would not forgive a single miscalculation. At 05:52 in the morning on May 24, 1941, Hood's forward turrets fired their first salvo, the thunder of her guns echoing across the frigid Denmark Strait. The order for a 20-degree turn followed, Captain Ralph Kerr's attempt to bring the ship's aft guns to bear. As Hood heeled into the maneuver, her vulnerable quarter faced the enemy. Minutes later, at 05:55, a shell from Prinz Eugen struck amidships, setting off a fire near the secondary ammunition lockers. Flames and smoke poured from the wreckage, but the ship pressed on, gunners still at their posts. Then, at precisely 0600, Bismarck's fifth salvo found its mark. Eyewitnesses described a blinding flash near the mainmast, followed by a column of flame that tore through the decks. The explosion split Hood in two. her bow rising briefly before plunging beneath the waves. In less than 3 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy vanished, leaving only burning oil and scattered debris behind. Out of a crew of 1,418, just 3 men, Ted Briggs, William Dundas, and Robert Tilburn, clung to a Carly float in the freezing water. For more than 3 hours, they drifted among wreckage and fuel, battered by waves and cold. At 09:15, the destroyer HMS Electra arrived at 63 degrees 20 minutes north, 32 degrees 40 minutes west, pulling the survivors from the sea. Their rescue would provide the only first-hand accounts of the disaster, a human thread connecting the loss to the families and nation waiting for news. The scale and speed of Hood's destruction demanded answers that only science and survivor memory could begin to provide. Robotic cameras descended through 2,800 meters of cold Atlantic water, their light sweeping across a seabed littered with twisted steel. The remains of HMS Hood lay scattered in 3 main sections, bow, midship, and stern, spread across a debris field more than a mile wide. Forensic analysts pored over the remotely operated vehicle imagery, searching for the story written in metal and fracture lines. The stern's armor plates, once riveted tight, had peeled outward like petals under enormous pressure. This pattern could only be explained by a violent explosion from within the ship, not by any torpedo or external blast. No holes or blast marks marred the hull's exterior, ruling out theories of a submarine attack. Attention turned to the rudder, still locked hard at a 20-degree angle to port. This detail matched historical accounts of Hood's final moments, a sharp turn intended to bring her aft turrets to bear, exposing her most vulnerable quarter. The forensic evidence left little doubt. The explosion struck as the ship was maneuvering, confirming the timeline described by the survivors and the battle's observers. Metallurgical analysis and debris mapping pointed to a chain reaction deep inside the ship. The likeliest scenario, supported by the spread of wreckage and the condition of the plating, began with a 380mm shell from Bismarck bursting in a 4-inch magazine. The resulting fire and shockwave ignited the main 15-inch magazine below, unleashing a catastrophic detonation that tore Hood apart in seconds. The physical testimony of the wreck finally settled decades of debate, replacing speculation with the hard language of steel and science. Today, HMS Hood rests under legal protection. Her remains a silent warning beneath the waves. As technology continues to unveil old secrets, the line between myth and truth narrows, but it never disappears entirely. The sea keeps its testimony, but remembrance is our responsibility. History's lessons endure only if we choose to listen.